All right, let's talk about taking notes, specifically in this video, taking notes during class, and in the next video, we'll talk about taking notes outside of class. And taking notes is a little bit controversial because in general, if you look at the evidence for it, summarizing, i.e. kind of writing summaries of stuff with the book open, is generally considered a fairly low utility thing according to Professor Dunlosky and his colleagues, the guys who reviewed thousands of studies that looked at this sort of stuff. They found that the people who sort of summarize content don't do very well compared to the people that just test themselves on the content. Because summarizing content is usually a passive process, and going back to our fundamental idea, the harder our brains have to work to do something, the more likely we are to remember the thing. That's partly why taking notes is controversial. But you know, in a video that I put out in like 2018 or something, talking about why taking notes was not effective, there were so many people that commented being like, you know, feeling like this was blasphemy, that, you know, how on earth can you possibly learn anything by not taking notes? Like, you know, surely you have to go to your lecture, and then after the lecture you have to come home and you have to make notes on the lecture, and then you can learn the notes later on. And yeah, I get it. I mean, it's really hard to get over the whole making notes thing. There are a few ways that we can actually make it more effective. So firstly, I think kind of splitting it up into these two, like thinking about it in these two different ways is how I think about it. So during class and then after class. So in this video, we're talking about during class. The first thing to say is that there's quite a lot of evidence about this sort of stuff, but basically handwriting our notes is better for us than typing up our notes. And there's lots of evidence about this, but again, this might seem blasphemous to those of us who take our laptops and see everyone with their MacBook Airs out and, like, you know, bashing stuff on Evernote or Notion or OneNote or whatever the, you know, note-taking app of the flavor of the month is. But handwriting notes does have more evidence behind it. So firstly, handwriting notes is supposedly better because it helps us think a little bit more intensely. For example, there was this study done by Washington University in St. Louis in America, and they were comparing students who took notes by hand versus students who took notes with a laptop during a lecture. And they found that if they were tested immediately after the lecture, the ones with a laptop did a little bit better than the ones who were taking notes by hand. But if they were tested 24 hours after the lecture, then they found that the ones who did the handwriting performed better than the ones who typed up stuff with a laptop. And when they repeated the test a week later, they found that the handwriting students, again, you know, had a better grasp of the concepts than the ones who took notes just using a laptop. And this kind of ties in with my own experience of this. So I used to take notes on a laptop until I discovered this research, and then I switched to taking notes by hand. And I used to find that when taking notes with a laptop, you know, I fancy myself as a pretty fast typist. So I would end up almost transcribing what the lecturer was saying in real time. And A, that would be really annoying for the people on my row. B, it would be a little flex for me because I'd be like, hey, look at me, I can type fast, aren't I cool? You know, please be friends with me. But the most important thing was that I ended up not really absorbing what was going on in the lecture because I was just sort of, again, I was passively doing it because I didn't have to. It was basically a hindbrain activity where a kind of lecturer would say something and I would just kind of start typing away, and then I'd find my brain wandering and I'd just still be typing what the lecturer was saying. But again, coming back to a fundamental point, the harder we have to work to do stuff, the more likely we are to remember it. And so passively typing out what the lecturer was saying wasn't very effective for me. But I found that when I switched to handwriting my notes, it meant that, you know, obviously I can handwrite a lot slower than I can type. And so I had to prioritize the bits that I was going to handwrite. And so I ended up actually focusing on the lecture a lot more, like figuring out what are the key points here, what do I actually need to know from this, and what's the general structure of the lecture. And I found that handwriting those, and then later on when I'd get home, I would scan that piece of paper into OneNote, which I was using at the time, and then expand on it using screenshots and typed up text and stuff. But I found that actually writing it out by hand helped me actually grasp the concept a lot better than when I was typing out the notes. And just to corroborate this point, we've got evidence from a study in 2014, which was done at Princeton and UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, I think. And they got students to listen to talks on various topics like algorithms and bats and stuff, while either writing notes with a keyboard or writing notes with pen and paper. And they did it for 67 students, and they tested them immediately after the lecture and a week later. And in these tests, they found that the longhand note takers did significantly better than laptop note takers, despite the fact that laptop note takers had more notes to look at. This guy called Kenneth Cura at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, he said that the very feature that makes laptop note taking so appealing, i.e. the ability to take notes more quickly, is also what undermined the learning. So yeah, when we're taking notes with our laptop, we end up with lots more notes than when we take notes by hand, but that's not good. It's passive, it's not very effortful. And there's also a bit of evidence that when we handwrite stuff like that, the act of handwriting it forms an association with our brains that actually improves our memory. And I'll put like sources here somewhere, so you can follow up on these sources if you really want to. But yeah, handwriting notes is generally better according to the evidence than typing them out with a laptop. Now, there's a few different methods of doing this. Often these days, in the modern age, we might get like PowerPoint PDFs. and then you can print those out or use them on your iPad with Apple Pencil or whatever. You can get your PowerPoint print PDFs and then annotate them during the lecture. That's sometimes what I do if I have a PDF to annotate. What I used to do in med school is kind of write things out by pen and paper, and then I would scan them, but then I got an iPad later on, and I've switched now entirely to the iPad Pro method of note-taking. The third method is actually really good. It's called the Cornell note-taking system. And the idea behind the Cornell system is that on one side of the paper or your iPad or whatever, you've got your notes from the class, but on the other side, like, you've written questions for yourself. And the idea behind that is that as we're studying our notes, as we're going over our notes, instead of doing the passive thing of rereading our notes and highlighting them, which is totally pointless and a complete waste of time because it's purely passive, instead of doing that, we are covering up the actual notes and we're just looking at the questions. And then we're asking ourselves the questions, being like, oh, okay, what are the 4 chambers of the heart? Or, how does thyroid cancer work? Or what is calcitonin and where is it produced and what's the function? And that would correspond to the answer that we've taken in our notes. But the point is we've written the question for it as well. And so we are forcing ourselves to use active recall, to use retrieval. Going back to the thing about active recall that we talked about a few videos ago, the more we retrieve information from our brains, the more likely we are to strengthen the connections to that information. So I really like the Cornell method. And in fact, these days I use the app Notion to, accomplish the Cornell method of note-taking. And I will link there somewhere to one of my YouTube videos about this. It's like a 25-minute long YouTube video that goes in depth about exactly how I use Notion to take notes. And that would be what I would do if I was starting medical school from day 1 today. And finally, the third thing you can do to take notes in class is you can use a mind map, spider diagrams, topic in the middle, and then stuff going off on either side. I'm not a huge fan of mind maps in class because you never really know how much information the lecturer or the professor is going to say. And so I find that it ends up getting very, very crowded. I prefer to just kind of take notes linearly with the subheadings in mind. But mind maps do work for some people. I've got a few friends from medical school who are big on using mind maps when taking notes in class, so that's always an option. But to be honest, the whole taking notes in class for me thing, ever since I realized that taking notes is not very effective, the only reason, realistically, that I actually take notes in class is because it helps keep me awake. It's so hard, as you all know if you've been to university lectures. It is literally so hard to stay awake during a lecture. And so I found that for me, if I sit in the front row and I force myself to take notes, it means I'm far more likely to stay awake. And then the notes that I've got usually are fairly minimalistic, mostly based on the subheadings rather than the kind of nitty-gritty detail of the content, which means I do get a broad brush stroke understanding of the content, even if I don't get all the details there and then. But most importantly, it keeps me awake. So that's just a little bit of advice about how to take notes during class. In general, the evidence suggests that handwriting on notes is probably better than typing them out with a laptop. But, you do you. I'm not here to preach. I'm kind of here to preach. But there's different methods that work for different people. And the evidence generally suggests handwritten versus laptop. But if you're super keen to use your laptop and to type away and to show off to your friends, how fast you can type, that's absolutely fine by me. It's all good. So I'll see you in the next video where we'll talk about taking notes after class, which is a very different thing. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.